Do you find that you censor yourself when a topic like abortion, guns, or queer rights comes up? Or maybe does the mere mention of these topics increase your blood pressure and give you anxiety? If so, congratulations, you are not alone. Truth is that these and other hot button topics, whether it's like immigration or Donald Trump or climate change, cause real anxiety and stress, partly because they are so tied to the polarization problem in our country. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 reasons why hot button topics like these tend to make polarization worse. And be sure to stick to the end because I'll then share 3 tips on how you can lower the volume and have more productive, real conversations about these controversial conversations. So first, topics that go to core beliefs and values tend to be more susceptible to what I would call black, white, or right-wrong thinking than other topics. So at least some of the topics on this highly controversial list feel like they touch, for many people, on some core values and core beliefs. And a lot of the work in my field, when we talk about, for example, moving from positions to interests, tend to look at conflicts that certainly matter to people, but they're not considered necessarily identity-based topics that are at the level of core values and beliefs. Now, part of, I think, what has been challenging and a real consequence of polarization is that there are certain topics that have become what I would call proxies for core values and beliefs. So in other words, if we really were to look at the issue, it isn't really about one's identity. It isn't really about one's autonomy. But it's a way of negotiating that autonomy around a substantive issue. So, for example, gun rights in the United States. We have a long tradition, and in fact it is embedded in our Constitution, that the right to bear arms is a constitutional right. It's actually our Second Amendment. But at this particular moment in our highly polarized world, our highly polarized country, the mere mention of this can feel very black, white, right, wrong, depending on what side of the political fence you sit on. Most Americans, actually, when they think hard about it, believe that people should be allowed to bear arms and there should be some reasonable regulation around that. In the same way that people have free speech rights and there are some reasonable regulations around that. For example, you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater when there is not, in fact, a fire. But the problem is that because things feel so polarized, the mere mention of the issue feels like we need to go into our camps and we see things as absolute. This is worsened by a second challenge, which is that political pundits and politicians on both sides of the political aisle tend to use these highly emotional and controversial issues as web issues, right? And they do this to raise money, to stoke flames, and to win elections. So let's look at another one of these hot button issues, abortion. So with the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, so since 1973, right, abortion has been a hotly contested issue in American politics. In fact, both sides, Republicans and Democrats, have often used this issue to raise money. But with the reversal of Roe v. Wade in the Dobbs decision, it has now become a touchstone issue, a way for Democrats to raise a huge amount of money and for Republicans to counter that. And so there's a highly nuanced and complicated issue, an issue that really doesn't lend itself particularly well to on-off, yes-no, or binary thinking, right? It raises issues around maternal health. It raises issues around morality, around personal ethics, around religious views, around what our society cares about, around childcare and education and healthcare. It's extremely complex. It's extremely dense and nuanced. And yet, politicians and pundits use it in this simplifying way because it's a way to fund their elections. Third challenge, and this is a really one I'm very sensitive to, is that these highly controversial issues, it is not just a wedge issue. It is not just raising a lot of money. In fact, these issues are extremely important for relevant portions of our population. So the stakes truly are very high. And this connects to the fact that, so if you, for example, are a young woman faced with an unwanted pregnancy, whether or not you have a right to abortion isn't academic. It isn't something that's debated. It isn't something that lends itself to a nuanced conversation. If you are a queer person or if you are trans, your rights, your ability to feel like you are an equal person in the world really matters in terms of how this comes out. If you are perhaps someone of a minority religious view, your religious freedom, your ability to live according to what your faith tells you, this really matters. And so as much as I believe there are better ways to have these conversations, it's not true to say these are just academic issues because the stakes are extremely high and extremely relevant for the people who are affected. So, with all of this complication, what are some tips for how we can have better conversations around these hot button issues? Given just how challenging it is to have a productive conversation around these issues, what are 3 tips that can help us lower the volume and be more constructive? So the first will come as no surprise. It's really looking for the nuance in these issues. I get why there's a strong invitation to take to the ramparts and to fly the flag for your side. But in a conversation, there is actually something to be learned and there's something to communicate. And if you're really trying to communicate to something to someone who sees it differently, flying your flag higher and screaming more loudly is unlikely to persuade them. Maybe you'll get more people to your side, but what you're unlikely to do is actually have any chance of creating any kind of common ground, connection, or persuasive resonance with the person on the other side. And so my invitation is any issue that's really complicated, any issue where people have varying viewpoints is an issue where there's some nuance, where there's some complexity. And so look for that in these conversations. Secondly, get curious. If you feel like you know it all, then that's a really hard way to have a productive conversation. Many years ago, one of my colleagues, a world-class mediator whose name is Susan Pizzebo, following a terrible killing at an abortion clinic in Boston, gathered a group of pro-choice and pro-life women and began what ended up being a multi-year facilitated dialogue again between these women. I want to be clear, this was not easy to do. These were not people who had bland views on the topic. These were pro-life activists and pro-choice activists. I also want to be clear that at the end of these conversations that occurred over many years, no one's views shifted in terms of their stance on pro-life or pro-choice issues. But coming together and cultivating curiosity did result in something different. Genuine relationships were created across those lines of difference, and common ground was found between the parties. And instead of demonization and dehumanization, connection and concern grew. I'm going to give you another example, also occurring in Boston. In the early 2000s, when the state of Massachusetts was the first state in the United States to find a constitutional claim to marriage equality, the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Boston worked very hard to have that overturned. During the same time, however, a group of LGBTQ Catholics and some Catholic priests actually met together off the record for facilitated conversations to try to understand each other's perspective more. Now, did that change either of the group's feelings on the issue? It did not. Did it change some of the messaging that came from the Archdiocese of Boston, particularly around being more pastoral toward LGBTQ persons? It did. So becoming curious is really essential to having productive conversations. Lastly, if you're engaging one of these conversations, it's important to avoid fueling the flame. So what I mean by that is not that you should somehow be less assertive about your viewpoint, less passionate about what matters to you and why. What it does mean, though, is finding a way to be assertive that actually increases the likelihood that the other side can hear you and appreciate your view. And so that means avoiding name calling. That means avoiding characterizations about the other person. So if you look at the abortion issue, calling the other side baby murderers is not constructive. Or calling the other side woman haters is not constructive. So there is a way to share your viewpoint assertively and constructively without adding to the flame. So, to the degree these topics are of interest to you, I want to encourage you to watch this next video, which is How Does Political Polarization Lead to Gridlock in Congress? Also, I'd be grateful if you could subscribe to this channel, ring the bell, and like this video. And if you want to learn more about how to have difficult conversations, check out my website, bobbordone.com. Okay, you know you want to learn more about political polarization in Congress. Keep watching.